So Kansas, there we go, recording in progress. So now everybody gets to hear on the recording that it's Kansas Day. Kansas became a state on this date in 1861, so 164 years ago. And our state motto is Ad Astra per Aspera, which means to the stars through difficulty in Latin, which I think is a valuable motto to have. So I also want to give a quick shout out to my colleague, Drew. Drew is a fabulous staff member at our Center for Applied Research and Evaluation. And while I am great with content, I am not great with slides. And they were super helpful in moving my content to the slide presentation that you're going to see today. And I am so grateful. I also want to recognize that today is Lunar New Year. And I'll let Drew, do you want to introduce yourself as well? We're sitting in the same room, so that's why I keep looking over there. Oh, I do. Hmm. Oh, that's going to be, that's true. It will. Okay.
Hi, so we were just coordinating the speaker and audio situation so that you don't hear an echo. So like Sarah said, I am Drew T. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm Vietnamese, so I did want to wish y'all a happy Lunar New Year today. And I don't know if anybody speaks Viet, but Chúc mừng năm mới is how you say it in Viet, just so that you guys have that information. And I'm excited to get to listen to Dr. Sarah talk today about the construction of surveys and administration.
Okay. Did we successfully do that? I think we did. That's awesome. So I will give you all the same disclaimer that I give during every survey school session I've ever done. This is we've done this in Kansas for, I don't know, 18 months. We do like a quick, just a 10-minute and our monthly check-ins survey school. And I'll give you the same disclaimer. For some of you all, this will be information that you already know, but hopefully it is a good review for you. And if it's not a good review, it's only an hour. So you only got to hang in there for an hour. You also are free to hang up or move to another session. That is totally all right as well. So just feel free to do whatever you need to do. For the first part of our time together, I'm going to focus on survey construction. And this is going to be focused on, so how do we ask good questions? What does that look like? Asking good questions. And then whatever time we have remaining, I'm going to talk more about survey administration. And do please feel free to ask questions at any time. Because I am presenting, I'm not very good at monitoring the chat, but Drew will keep an eye on things for me. And if somebody needs to raise a hand and ask a question, please feel free to do that as well. Okay, so the most important thing that I will always say about any survey is that you need to know your purpose, and related to that, know your audience also. But if you know me, you have heard me say this before. And if you don't know me, this is the first time, but definitely not the last time that you are going to hear me say this, but stay focused on purpose. You want to make sure that all of the questions on your survey are connected to the purpose. And yes, I do mean all of the questions should be connected to your purpose, because unnecessary questions waste time, yours and your participants, and you just risk confusing respondents and or potentially causing them to stop taking your survey because they're being asked things that they find irrelevant. So don't ask questions, folks, just because this might be interesting or maybe we want to know this later. Stay focused on questions that are useful and actionable. So those are the things that are going to be closely connected to your purpose. And once you're clear on your purpose, the next most important thing to keep in mind when collecting survey data is confidentiality. We want people to be honest in their responses, right? Because that's the whole point. In order to be honest, people have to feel like they can trust the organization or the entity that's collecting the information. They want to be able to trust that you're protecting their data, especially if there's potentially sensitive information that's being collected. And just a quick note, just because you don't think something is sensitive doesn't mean someone else feels the same way about this. So this is true, again, for all surveys in all situations. Above all else, we have to make sure that we protect the confidentiality and the well-being of those that we survey. Quick note about anonymous and confidential, because I've said confidential a few times. Anonymous means that someone takes a survey and I don't have any way to know who that is. So a lot of times if people are completing something online, that's anonymous. I don't know who completed the survey. If somebody takes a paper survey and hands it directly to me, I know that that survey was yours. So I'm going to keep that confidential. I'm not going to tell everybody else that was yours, but I potentially could know. So in that case, that's what confidential means. Anonymous means there's no way for me to know it was you. Confidential means I might know it was you, but I'm not telling people that. So just a note on that. An ethical survey is one in which people can answer honestly with no concern about recrimination, exposure, psychological harm. In particular, be very thoughtful about how your questions might make people feel. So we don't want respondents to end surveys feeling frustrated, ignorant, scared, stupid, or having reignited feelings of past trauma. We don't want people to feel that way when they finish a survey. So the next thing I like to talk about is brevity. And just quick definition, brevity is conciseness. So the concise and exact use of words. And guess what? If you stay focused on purpose, that will also help with brevity. So when you have an introduction to your survey, you want to have brevity in your introduction. And why? Because people don't read. People don't read. The most important things to include in your introduction are things that fall under what we refer to as informed consent. So people are consenting to take your survey and they have the information they need to decide. So what is this survey about? This is where you're going to highlight your purpose, right? Why am I receiving this survey? So why should I participate? Why should I care about this? Who is this survey coming from? And what are they doing with the information I give them? And then also, how long is this going to take me? Is this going to take me 10 minutes? Is this going to take me an hour? It's important for me to have that information to decide whether I want to engage with the survey. The other thing you want to maintain brevity in is in your questions and in your answer responses that are available to folks. And why? Because people don't read. So when you can provide definitions to things if you need to. So if you need to define an issue or a concept that people might be unfamiliar with, or where you need to provide a common definition, you can sometimes do that in the narrative right before the question. But note of caution, people maybe won't read that closely or may not read it at all. So if it's something that you really want people to read or focus in on, you just need to find a way to draw attention to it. So underline it, bold it, put it in different color text, something to get people to pay attention to the thing that's important for them to know. Another thing to keep in mind, though, is the questions themselves should still be clear, even if the concept or issue you're asking about needs some added layer of definition. And also, so I mentioned response categories. When you get too many response options, people also stop reading. So sometimes I have had this happen in my surveys where I had a long list of stuff for people to choose from, and somebody will pick other and then type in a response that I actually provided somewhere in that list. They just didn't see it, didn't read it, just skip to the end. I'm just going to type the thing I want to type, even though it might have been captured in the list. So also, want to maintain some level of brevity in your overall survey. Why do we want to keep our survey relatively short and concise? Because people are busy. They have other important things to do. They also have other unimportant things to do that they might rather do than take your survey. So we want to maintain brevity in that as well. And in general, when you think about, I want somebody to take this survey as soon as they see it, as soon as it hits their inbox, I want them to see it and go, I can do that right now. About 10 or 15 minutes is what people are willing to spend kind of right away. But don't lie. Don't tell people it's going to take 10 or 15 minutes and then they get in half an hour later and they're frustrated with you. You don't want that either. And again, the more invested or interested someone is in what you're asking about, so your purpose, the more they're connected to your purpose, the more time they're going to be willing to spend on your survey. So make sure you're planning accordingly. I know we did some work with a particular county on their community health needs assessment. They had a lot of partners involved in developing the survey who were invested in the questions they wanted to have on there. They hadn't done one in like 10 years. And it was a lengthy survey. And we kind of told them, we're not sure that people are going to take this. This is really long. but the people who helped us develop the survey were super invested in making sure they got responses, and they did. They totally came through. They had a lot of people complete a very lengthy survey, but it's because the people who developed the survey were invested and they connected very closely with people in the community for them to see why they should care about it as well. So another thing to keep in mind is question flow. And that's the order in which you're asking your questions, right? So when you start your survey, you kind of want to ease people in by asking something that's relatively easy. So an easy question cognitively for me to answer. So generally, you don't want to start your survey with a big open-ended question. You don't want to start your survey with like a difficult or a sensitive question typically. A lot of times it'll say don't start your survey with a matrix item. So we've got a lot of questions and answer categories in the same table there. I am guilty of this. I do sometimes start my surveys with a small matrix, which again, I'm guilty of it. It's maybe not the best plan, but it is something that I do on occasion. It's also recommended that you don't start with your demographic items. So the one exception to this is when it's really important for you to know where people live. So if you need to know somebody's zip code or their county, then it's okay to kind of put that information at the beginning. So if you're doing like a community health assessment and you're promoting the survey widely, but you don't want people who don't live in the county to take it, you might put that at the beginning so that way you can weed people out and just send them straight to the end of your survey. Also, sometimes age is a thing you want to ask at the beginning if you have any concern that people under the age of 18 might click in and you need to weed them out for some reason. You also want to group your questions into sections. So you don't necessarily have to label those sections, but it just helps respondents organize their thoughts. So if you have a section on knowledge or attitudes or things you want to see happen in the community, you can break the survey into manageable chunks. That makes it easier for them to complete on their end, and it makes your data already kind of organized well on the back end. So everybody wins there. Additional response options you might want to think about including on different items is other. So other with an option to include some, explanation or description. Think about giving people the option to say, I prefer not to answer that question. I don't want to answer that. Also letting people say, I don't know. I don't really know, or this is not applicable to me in some way. These response options help prevent people from getting stuck or quitting because they just don't know how to answer something on your survey. I'm going to take just a second. Is there anything I should be looking at in the chat? No, I'm good. Thank you, Drew. Okay. Next slide. Okay. So this has kind of a lot on it. I'm going to walk us through all of it. So you know the purpose of your survey and you're only asking questions related to the purpose. You got some well-written questions, clearly asking about one thing at a time. Great. One of my favorite survey school sessions that I did this year was focused on the Olympics as an example. So you see, I'm going to repeat that here. I'm a big fan of the Olympics and I watch it as much as I possibly can when it's on. So I talked about the Olympics as an example of different question types. And so just fun fact, we are 1 year and 1 week away from the next Winter Olympics. Those will kick off February 6th of 2026. So I am going to go ahead and use the Olympics. So hopefully that's okay with everybody. So what are all the ways we could find out what everyone's favorite Olympic sport is? We could just ask an open-ended item, right? We could say, what is your favorite Olympic sport? Do we care though if it's summer or winter? And what if somebody just types in volleyball? Is that men's volleyball? Is that women's volleyball? What is it beach volleyball? Is it regular volleyball? What if somebody types more than one thing? What if somebody types something like anything USA or I don't care? Can we make sense of all of that open data? Absolutely. Is it a little bit harder to do that? Yeah, it kind of is. So in situations like this, depending on the number of people you have or anticipate having, complete your survey. An open-ended item or two might be okay. But when you think about the amount and type of data you receive on the back end and what you intend to do to make sense of it, maybe it would be better to provide some response options. So a lot of times we know the responses that we expect to receive. So right now we're talking about Olympic sports, right? So we know what those are. We could provide them. Another solid example that people understand pretty well is age. So open-ended, asking people open-ended what their age is versus providing some age categories for folks. So if you leave it open without a validation, people will type a sentence. I am 44. And that's not really useful for analysis. It requires some data cleaning. And even if you do include validation, so they can only type a number, right? No words, just numbers, and they type 44. Do you care that you had X number of people who said they were 44? Or are you going to group those ages into response categories anyway on the back end? And if so, just go ahead and do it on the front end. Provide those categories up front. That saves you some time on the back end. I'm going to add a quick note here about AI and the use of it in qualitative data analysis. So I work at a university, and they continue to remind me that publicly available generative AI tools like ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude, they all use the data I provide to train their language models, their AI language models. So as of now, I choose not to enter my data into publicly available AI tools just to ensure data privacy. Many survey platforms like Alchemer are starting to incorporate this into their programs, so you can do some AI analysis of your qualitative data in their system. And so I would suggest, as those start to become available, start there. And I would always suggest that you are familiar with your data before trusting any sort of auto-generated response. And also make sure that you were honest about the use of that in helping to generate those responses. I know our school district had like a large listening type thing, and they used AI to analyze all the responses they got, and parents got real mad the AI was used because they felt like, I took time to give you a response and then nobody read it. So just making sure that you're aware of how the people that you're surveying might feel about that as well. Another option is a ranking item. So rank the following Olympic sports in order from most favorite to least favorite. Let's say that would be the way you could do that. Now, the medal count at the Olympics demonstrates why I'm not really a big fan of ranking items. So this summer, when I was watching the Olympics, the US at the time had the most medals overall. So we had 26 medals total. Japan had half as many medals as we did. They had 13 medals, but they had more gold medals than we did. So they had 7 gold medals, which was more than half of their medals. And we had 4 gold medals out of 26. So that was 15% of our medals. So which country's performing better at the Olympics? So which one's doing better? The one with more gold medals or the one with more medals overall? So are there ways to calculate that? Absolutely. So we could assign weights, right? You get 3 points for gold, 2 for silver, 1 for bronze, and then add it up and see where everything shakes out. But that's a little more work, right? So another thing about ranking items, if you've used them in your surveys, sometimes they are not cognitively intuitive. And you don't want to make your list too long, or if you make it long, don't make them rank every single item in your list. But when you set those up, sometimes you're dragging and dropping in the same list to move your favorite to the top. Sometimes you drag into another column. Sometimes you're assigning a number. If you're assigning a number, people need to know, is one the best or something else? So just know that if you choose to use a ranking item, that sometimes they're a little less cognitively intuitive on the user end as to how to do that. So another note that I will give, as always, is around purpose and also simplicity. So does the purpose of your survey require that an item is ranked? Or do you really just need to know the top X number of priorities? So if that's the case, you could just use a multi-response item. And that's what I usually use. I don't typically use a ranking item because select your top 3 or whatever usually gets the information I need. So that's cognitively easier for your participants. It's easier for me to pick my 3 favorites than to rank my 3 favorites. So cognitively easy for me and easier for you on the back end with your data analysis. So gold medal win, everybody wins on making things cognitively easier. So I also mentioned a multiple choice where you can select one or select multiple options from a list. So what are your favorite Olympic sports? Pick your top X number from the following list. So you can let people pick 1, 2, 3, however many you want to let folks pick from a discrete list, and the number that you allow people to pick just depends on how long your list is. If you've got a long list, you can allow people to pick more favorites from the list. How you order your list is up to you. You could do that in alphabetical order. You could put things into categories. Survey programs also allow you to sort of have the list appear randomly in a different order for different participants as they pull it up. So that way you don't have any sort of primacy effects where the things at the top get picked more than the things at the bottom. So you can do check all that apply. Sometimes people will check all of the things though, and that's not always helpful. You can have people pick their top 1, 3, 5, whatever you want. So make sure you know your audience in this case. Make sure that the people you anticipate participating in your survey see themselves reflected in those answer categories. So let's say we were asking about Olympic sports, and my favorite is rugby, and rugby doesn't show up anywhere on the list. So I don't see myself reflected in the answer categories, and that can be frustrating for people. You also want to make sure that you have mutually exclusive categories. So I'll go back to using age as an example. You don't want to have age categories or any categories that overlap. So you wouldn't want to have, is your age between 20 and 30, 30 and 40, 40 and 50? So what if I'm 30? Do I pick the 20 to 30 or do I pick the 30 to 40? So you got to make sure that your categories don't overlap. Another option is a Likert or a single response item. So for example, how important is it to you to watch the following Olympic events? This is another way to get at what Olympic sports are most of interest to people. So of course, there's a chance that someone would rate everything as like super important, would never miss it. And we can remind people to think about things like relative importance of each item, recognizing that some people won't read and some people won't heed that we ask them to do that. But thinking about your Likert or rating items, you want to make sure that you're aware of the number of response categories that you're giving people. So when thinking about the number of options you provide in general, so for rating, so again, for Likert type items where it's like strongly disagree to strongly agree, in general, people can't really make meaningful distinctions between a scale of more than about 7 points. So you don't want to go 10, 12, you want to maintain something that's very manageable. So 7 points or smaller. And you also want to make sure that your scale is grounded. And what that means is that you tell participants what each of the numbers on the scale mean. So I'm not just saying 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree. I'm telling them what 2, 3, and 4 mean as well, because we don't want to let people decide for themselves what those mean. We want to tell them and not let them just decide what they think it means. I do like to go like to midpoint or not to midpoint, right? So if I am doing a printed survey, I will always put a midpoint because someone will create it if I don't give it to them. So if I have a paper survey and I have a 6-point scale, someone will write 3.5 in the middle or circle the 3 and the 4 in the middle. So they will create a midpoint. So if I have a printed survey, I will always make sure to provide a midpoint. On an online survey, you've got a little more flexibility if you want to do sort of a forced choice. They got to pick a side. They got to go to the positive or to the negative. That is up to you, and that is always your choice. You can repeat scales. So sometimes if you repeat scales, participants know, okay, I've seen this scale, I know how this works, and they can respond accordingly without having to relearn what they're being asked or relearn a scale. But you don't want to do it too much. So you do want to make sure that you're keeping them engaged, you're keeping them reading your survey, and that they're not getting bored with what you're doing. So repeat scales some, maybe not too much. There's also been conversation about, I've had folks say, well, can we start with the positive ones? So you've heard me say 1, strongly disagree. That's just my default. In general, people tend, not all people, but some people tend to be less likely to say negative things. So if you start with the positive, that increases your likelihood for positivity bias. So I tend to start with either left to right, top to bottom. I'm going to start with, if I have a scale, I'm going to use the lowest or the negative at the top as the 1 or on the left as the 1. So again, it just decreases the chances for positivity bias in your responses. Another thing that you want to make sure you're doing on a scale is that you're providing an equal number of positive and negative responses. So if you've got a midpoint, you got a solid neutral, you want to make sure you have an even number of positive and negative responses. So if at the end of this session, I was to send you a survey that was like, how great was this session? Was it excellent? Was it pretty darn good? It was great. Like, but I don't give you an option to say, I didn't like that, or that wasn't good. You want to make sure that you've got an equal number of positive and negative response options available to folks. Also, continue to keep in mind the mutually exclusive categories, so categories that do not overlap, and also those response options I mentioned before. So making sure that maybe people can say other or prefer not to answer or NA or I don't know, making sure people have those options available to them as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how to ask clear questions and avoid confusing questions. So asking clear questions is a little easier said than done, but it is also very important. So you want to make sure that your questions have one meaning for all of your respondents so that you know everybody is responding to the same thing, right? And that the questions are only asking about one thing at a time so that you know what everybody's responding to. One of these examples is to avoid double-barreled questions. So these are questions that ask about multiple issues or items in the same question. So for example, you can see the questions up there. How often do you have episodes of anxiety or depression? How would you rate the professionalism and concern shown to you by our staff? So when you look at those responses, how will you know whether an individual is dealing with anxiety or depression or both? And how will you know if your staff showed appropriate levels of professionalism and concern? So in both of these cases, these should be broken into at least two different questions. For example, how often do you get asked at a conference about food and lodging in the same breath? So those are two very different things. Quick tip, if you happen to see the word "and" in your survey question, take a closer look. So if I see the word "and" in one of my questions, I'm going to go, okay, am I asking about two things that can be asked together, or is this double-barreled and I need to split those up? So we can also ask questions that cover multiple dimensions. So for example, what is your current capacity to meet your financial obligations? Well, capacity involves multiple elements, right? So physical, psychological, financial. And financial obligation also involves multiple elements. So I might have a lot of bills and I'm fine paying most of them, but now I have a big medical bill and that's a problem. So there are a lot of things that are going on in that question. And responses to questions like those end up being general, and they're not likely to help you pinpoint the issue or where to make changes or improvements. So it'll be more difficult to connect them to your purpose and make those items actionable, right? So another thing that you want to do is avoid vague questions that allow for multiple definitions. So things like, how often do you use drugs? That seems like a clear question, but people will define drugs differently. So that could include illegal drugs, prescription drugs, over-the-counter medications. It could also involve alcohol and tobacco. So when people respond, you won't have any way to know which of those things they're providing a response on. So again, you heard me say you can provide definitions when needed. So if you need to provide a definition, go ahead and do that. Call attention to it if you need to. And also make sure your questions are clear, even if you had to define something previously. So one example of that is we had an item on a survey that said, I eat healthy foods. And then we put in parentheses, healthy foods are defined as nutritious food and beverages, especially fruits and vegetables, fruits, low fat, fat-free dairy products, whole grains, and foods that are low in saturated trans fat, sodium, and added sugar. So there was a definition that was kind of provided to help people understand and be on the same page with what we meant by healthy foods. You can also add specificity. So be specific about it if need to. So one example related to healthy eating is, do you eat at least 2 cups of fruits or vegetables each day? So that's a more specific way to get at whether somebody's eating healthy. We added the specificity of 2 cups of fruits and vegetables, so a specific amount. You can also time bound something. So maybe some days I eat 2 cups of fruits and vegetables, and some days I don't. So how do I decide how best to answer that question? One way would be to add something that's time bound. So in the last 7 days, on how many days did you eat at least 2 cups of fruits or vegetables? So other things to keep in mind, knowing your audience, I've mentioned that. So make sure that the people you anticipate taking your survey can see themselves in the response options, right? And that they're knowledgeable about the issues you're asking about. So be aware of what the population you're engaging with will know or not know about the issues or topics that you're asking. So remember, you want people to see themselves in the questions and the response categories, and we don't want to make people feel dumb. So how likely are they to be informed about what you're asking about? So one example in community health assessments, sometimes people do want to ask those under the age of 18, some items, not the full survey, but like we wouldn't want to ask kids in a community about insurance, health insurance availability. They probably don't know. So also another way to deal with that is making sure that people have the option to say, I don't know, when you're asking about certain issues. Okay. Anything I need to check in the chat? I think we're okay. All right. So again, continuing on with clear and not confusing questions, think about making sure your questions are value free. So when you ask a question like, how much do you like broccoli? Or you heard me say, how great was this presentation? Those convey a message of the value of liking something, right? So a better way to ask would be something like, how much do you like or dislike broccoli? How do you feel about broccoli? So these allow for responses at both ends of the spectrum. So I hate broccoli and I love broccoli, or I love roasted broccoli, but I don't really like steamed broccoli. So a lot of times I phrase questions with indicate your level of agreement or disagreement with the following statements, rather than just saying level of agreement. I include agreement or disagreement. So again, this will be particularly important if you're asking questions that might be sensitive or controversial. So again, avoiding value-laden items. And of course, stay focused on your purpose. And if you group questions into sections, that can be helpful as well. So another thing to think about is language and translation. So are you interested in having your survey available in other languages? One thing that we have discovered is that just because you make a survey available in a certain language does not mean that anyone who speaks that language will take it or take it in that language. So we had a survey available in English and Spanish at an event, and there were people that we knew spoke Spanish as their first language, and they still chose to take the survey in English rather than in Spanish. We've also made surveys available online for one community. We had the survey available in English, in Spanish, and Korean. And no one took the survey in Korean, and we had fewer than 10 take the survey online in Spanish. So also be aware of just the resources that are needed to translate surveys into other languages. There are a lot of options where this is getting better though, right? So Google Translate, and I think Taylor mentioned AI can do some of that translation. You just have to be aware of whether those translations are accurate and whether they're accurately asking the questions that you're trying to ask. And you also want to remember that if you've asked open-ended questions in another language, you're going to have data to translate on the back end as well. There's also some other language stuff that isn't about translation, but is also really important. So things like, I think you heard Aaron mention that they sometimes use AI to weed out some of this, but thinking about idioms. So that's things where the meaning of what you said is not literal. So I'm feeling under the weather. That's not literally what that means, but we know what that means. There's also slang terms, and this is typically language that's specific to a particular demographic. And I'm going to be embarrassed that I say it because I know I'm too old, but like the phrase spill the tea, that is a slang term for something, and I'm too old to say that. So I have to skip over it now. But there's also colloquialisms. Those are things that are maybe regional or specific to a particular country. There's also abbreviations. So like I said, I work for the Center for Applied Research and Evaluation. We say CARE, but you wouldn't know what that was if I didn't tell you right away. And also there are sometimes where there's really technical language or jargon that needs to be avoided as well. You want to pay attention to reading level. Again, 5th or 6th grade reading level is what we want to maintain for anything that's going out to sort of general public. There are free programs that can tell you, that can read actually Word can do it for you to look at what the language, what the reading level is for a document or a survey that you've developed. And while it's always important, obviously, if you're surveying minors, it's reading level is going to be particularly important as well. So I'm also going to talk about asking difficult questions and also about social desirability. So the first thing I'm going to go back to is what? Purpose. So when you're thinking about asking questions related to difficult or sensitive topics, you first want to really, really check, do we need this information? Like really, how important is it for us to ask these questions? Is it key to the purpose of our data collection and understanding this issue? Are there other ways we could get this information or similar information? So, and maybe it is. Maybe it is something that you have to ask. But you also want to know your audience. So make sure that the people you anticipate participating in your survey would be open to answering those types of questions. So again, you've decided it's key to your purpose. Now you want to also make sure that you give people notice. So you want to give people a warning or some kind of heads up that you're going to be asking them sensitive questions. You don't want people to get to this part of your survey and be surprised. So make sure that people know that this is coming, that you're going to ask about something potentially sensitive. And make sure that the questions don't require a response. So people can skip them if they feel uncomfortable. And also back to those response options. Can you provide them other with an opportunity to provide additional description? Can you allow them to say, I prefer not to answer that, or I don't know, or this is not applicable? Those are all things to keep in mind as well. Then there's also something that's referred to as social desirability. And there's a good definition up there, but this is the idea that people will give responses that they think are the appropriate response, even if it's not true for them. So there are things that we might ask about where we say that there's not a right or a wrong answer, but people know that there actually is. They know there is a right or a wrong answer. And if I give the wrong answer, people are going to think bad things about me, even if it's an anonymous survey. So we just want to be aware of when we're asking questions that might have a socially desirable response. And so how might we deal with that? One way we might deal with that is to reframe the question. So instead of focusing on the individual, reframe the question to ask about the community. So one example would be saying something like, how much do you approve or disapprove of hitting a person? Well, in general, people know we're not supposed to hit other people. And so another way you might ask that is something like, indicate how much you agree or disagree with the following statement. There are times when a person deserves to be hit. So that's a way to ask that might get a little bit more away from, is it okay to hit somebody? Another example would be asking a question like, how much do you think people risk harming themselves physically or in other ways if they, for example, smoke marijuana once or twice a week, or if they use electronic cigarettes daily, or if they use prescription drugs that are not prescribed to them? So the responses themselves don't tell us whether people engage in those activities, but what they do tell us is in which activities people perceive to be more harmful and would then, in theory, be a little less likely to participate in. So another thing to do to help with some of this is to pilot test your survey. So to assess, and this is good for all items, not just for those that might be difficult or socially desirable, but to assess whether you have a good survey, you can ask people who will not be taking the survey, in theory, to review it and tell you what those questions make them sort of think about or what they make them feel. So it's kind of more a form of cognitive interviewing. So you're not asking them to answer the questions, you're asking them to tell you what they understand the questions to mean, and what the questions make them think about and any issues they might see related to comprehension, or values connected to those. So back to confidentiality, social desirability always brings me back to that, asking difficult questions, sensitive items. We want to make sure, again, that we maintain the confidentiality and well-being of those that we're surveying, right? So we want to keep that in mind as well. Okay. A quick note on surveying minors or other vulnerable populations. So what is a vulnerable population? That's any group who, for whatever reason, does not have the ability to fully consent to their participation in a given study. So specific populations include those listed there. So children, minors, pregnant women, individuals who are incarcerated. There are also others to think about as well. So individuals experiencing homelessness. And while there are some who always fit into this category, depending on what your study entails, it'll be important to just consider whether certain populations might be considered vulnerable. So we did focus groups with women of childbearing age who were in residential treatment for opioid use disorder. That's probably a vulnerable population. Or when we did focus groups with WIC clients, some of them may or may not be documented. So we need to think about those things. And if you're including a vulnerable population in your study, I would highly, highly recommend utilizing an institutional review board. So IRB, Institutional Review Board, independently review research projects that involve human subjects. So they review procedures and protocols to ensure the protection of human subjects. Universities like ours have one, so I'm very familiar with ours. Hospitals a lot of times have them. There's also independent IRBs that can be hired to review individual projects. And this just IRB approval adds a layer of protection for you and also for your participants. Another thing to keep in mind is consent versus assent. So consent can only be given by individuals who are 18 or over. Not just consent, but informed consent. So you heard all those things I listed out before. People need to know how much time you're going to take, the types of questions you're going to ask, who will have access to their information, whether that's anonymous or confidential, how their information is going to be used, any benefits to participating, any risks to participating, and spoiler alert, there's always risks to participating, even if they're only minimal. So anything else that's important for people to know to make a decision about their involvement or participation. People also have to be able to withdraw their consent at any time without penalty. And so their participation should always be entirely voluntary. They should be able to stop at any time. Just because someone is not old enough to consent does not mean that they should not be asked if they are willing to participate. So that's assent. So for example, my kids are 12 and 14. They're not legally old enough to provide consent, but they are most definitely old enough to have thoughts and opinions about doing things, and they should be given the opportunity to express their thoughts and opinions. So one time we were on vacation in Chicago, and one of the local universities was conducting research with children. They had a table set up near the park. I talked to one of the graduate students and I gave consent for my kids to participate. And then we also asked my kids if they were willing to participate. So they were able to give assent. Yes, we are interested in participating. Other things to think about are incentives. So they could be offered to increase response rate, but you have to make sure they are not coercive. And what's coercive to one population might what's not coercive to one population might be coercive to another. So thinking about dollar amounts there. And also in school settings, extra credit is not appropriate because that can be coercive. And also making sure keeping an eye on reading level and making sure that you're aware of what people will be knowledgeable about. And back to, does this connect to your purpose? Do you really need to hear from this particular population? And if so, there are ways to engage with them. And I know how much time do I have? I feel like I've been told.
1 minute.
1 minute? I thought I had till 2:45.
Do we have till 2:45? We can go till 2:45 if that's correct.
I don't know. Am I right?
There are a few questions in the chat.
Okay.
The plan was to have 15 minutes for questions, but
Oh, that's why. Okay. I was like, I thought I had till 2:45.
If you want to finish a thought, we can go a little bit longer.
Okay. All right. I have a couple of other slides I can just do really quickly. One is about methods of administration. So random sampling versus convenience sampling, a lot of people ask about this. And just so you know, most of the time, you pretty much have a convenience sample and there is nothing wrong with that. So in a random sample, that means everyone in your population, whatever your defined population is, has an equal probability of being selected. And most of the time, that's not what you're doing. And that's okay. So these are all the different ways you could distribute your survey. And for each of them, you should ask yourself, who might be left out here? Because in each of those, there are people who have the risk of being left out. So if you're doing a paper survey, where are you making your print versions available? How will people get those surveys back to you? And if you have print surveys, you want to make sure you have a plan for data entry. So including how to deal with incorrectly completed items. So if you said pick one and they picked more than one, or you said to pick 3 and they picked 4, or they created a midpoint when you didn't give them one. So also think about how you have to format things for print versus if it's online. For those who might be left out on paper surveys, people who are low vision. So one time we did a survey for older adults and we just made sure to use a larger font. It made the survey longer on paper, but the survey was easier for folks to read. Think about people who have difficulty reading or writing, either due to literacy issues or other physical issues they might be experiencing. And also, again, think about where you would have printed copies available. For the internet and online stuff, think about promotion. Where are you promoting this information? People who might be left out are those who don't have internet access and who don't have access to wherever you're promoting the survey. When you're doing things online, you also want to make sure you have a plan for bots or spam that might get into your survey, because that happens. Mail surveys. Think about whether you're printing a copy of the survey for people to complete and send back, or whether your mail is actually driving people to your online survey, getting people to go on the website and take your survey. So who might be left out when you think about this? People who are this is similar to like door to door. I skipped door to door, but there's an investment of time and staff on door to door, and who might be left out on that is people living in apartments, dorms, military housing, thinking about how addresses are selected. So this is true for that door to door and mailing. How do you pick addresses for things to go to? So one example was a survey sent out by the city was set out to with water bills. So your water bill had a survey with it. Well, what if you aren't the one who receives the water bill? So thinking about that. On phone surveys, this is something where the methodology is really starting to decline due to cell phone use is much higher. So landlines are less of a thing. Also caller ID. I don't ever answer the phone if I don't know the number on the other end. So more and more people are like that. It also, for those who might be left out, people, if you don't have a landline, maybe you aren't able to get access to the survey. People with cell phones that have an out-of-state area code. So I might live here in Kansas, but I didn't get my cell phone here. So my cell phone has an area code that's from a different state. So you want to think about how you decide which numbers get included and who to call. Also, just a quick plug, there are organizations that specialize in phone surveys, mail surveys. So if you think you want to do that, you can always access folks who specialize in that. Another note for incentives, it really doesn't take very much in the way of incentives for people to increase the likelihood that people will take your survey. So increasing response rate. I don't know if anybody's ever been selected for the Nielsen ratings. So that's things where you report what you watch on TV or what you listen to on the radio. But when they send it to you, they send you the survey with $2, two very crisp $1 bills. And then if you return the survey, you get a $10 bill. So it doesn't take very much to increase the likelihood of someone responding to your survey. And again, just making sure incentives are not coercive. Another note is just that there are certain types of people who tend to be overrepresented in surveys. So white folks, women, people who tend to be a little bit older, have slightly higher levels of educational attainment, middle to higher levels of income. These people tend to be overrepresented in a survey sample. So you want to think through how to increase response rates from other groups, or how to complement that survey data with other data collection. So we have used interviews and focus groups to help address that in the past. So if there's a specific population you want to hear of, you want to think about the best way to access that population. And honestly, some populations are just not going to take your survey. So if their input is of value to you, you just want to think about other ways to engage them. So for one community, we did a focus group at a weekly community dinner that was hosted at a church. So for that particular focus group, we were able to hear from individuals who are experiencing homelessness, and also folks who are experiencing food insecurity in the community. So we might not have had another way to hear from them. So I do have a few more slides, but I'm just going to skip them because what time are we at? I got 10 minutes. So I'm going to skip these next couple of slides and take time for some questions.
Great. In the chat, there are a few. One of which is, what tool do you use to check reading level on a survey? A lot of the free options I use to check reading levels need longer selections of text to provide a good estimate of reading level. In a survey, you have a bunch of short sentences.
I usually, if I have it in Word, I usually use, and I can't remember what it is because I haven't used it recently, but in Word, there is a way that you can just check what the reading level is. Like it'll run it in your Word document. And then I know Taylor mentioned using AI for it. I have not tried it. I've just used the word option, and I'm trying to look for what there's like a
Oh,
specific option.
Fleischman Kincaid or
Yes,
something.
thank you. That is what it is. I was like, I have it somewhere. It starts with an F. Yes.
And you can find it when you do the word count. I believe it's in the same part.
Yes.
And it looks like someone in the chat did suggest Grammarly as well.
Oh, yes, I do think Grammarly does that as well. I know some folks on staff at our office use that as well.
Another person asked what's colloquially.
Oh, colloquialisms. Those are things that tend to be, those are words that are more regional in nature or specific to countries. So one example, I don't think we really, soda and pop. I think we all know that those are the same word, but they're used different regionally. Or saying the word football. In the United States, I'm going to think of the Super Bowl, right? Because we said football. But in the rest of the world, football doesn't mean football like it does here. Football means soccer. And so those are things that are sort of colloquialisms, things that are more specific to a particular region or to a particular country.
Another question for a random adult survey. Are there successful strategies to reach young adults?
Ooh, for a random one, that one I'm less certain about. I know like one of the things that we ran into, I mentioned that, you tend to have older adults complete surveys, and we did a survey in a community that has a university. And so we knew there was a substantial population of younger adults in that community. And we utilized focus groups with younger folks in the community. That was how we dealt with not having them take it. But again, it is one of those things where you just want to, if you have age categories on your survey, if you know to keep an eye on your response rate, you can think about different ways to promote in spaces where those people might be.
That's all I see for questions. Does anyone else have questions that you have not put into the chat?
Well, and if we have 5 minutes, I can go through those last couple of slides if you want. If I can figure out how to go back, I think I can.
I want you to repeat something.
Absolutely.
When you were talking about having a midpoint on a scale and, 3, 4, 5 point, whatever Likert scales. And I think you were making a distinction that if it's a paper survey, then you've had the experience where folks might pencil in something that's not actually an option.
Yes.
I am a little bit old school. I grew up with 4-point scale is optimal because we want to make people choose, but I just would, if you have any other insights about that, I get the paper thing, but maybe there's even more that you could share with us.
Yeah, so when it's online, a lot of times, I'm not gonna lie, I use 4 or 6 for that reason, because it does kind of make people not be on the fence about things. But yeah, it also depends on like what are you asking about, and what are the types of response categories that make the most sense. Because there are times when I'm like, I really think there's only 4 options here. I don't think there needs to be a midpoint. I don't want to artificially craft a 5th response to put in the middle. But yeah, it has been my experience that on a paper survey, people will always pick, well, they'll make one. Somebody somewhere will make one. So the other thing you can do though in that situation is if you had a 4-point scale on a paper survey, you just decide ahead of time how you want to deal with the people who marked it incorrectly. So that way you're just dealing with it the same way every time.
Thank you.
We did have 2 additional questions come in.
Excellent.
Are we seeing more adult health surveys for the community health assessment moving toward convenience samples rather than random samples?
Yes. So I know for, I want to say almost, I'll say all, maybe I should just say almost all. For the community health assessments that we have done, they are pretty much always a convenience sample because we've got a survey link that we're promoting, right? There's no way for us to make that a random sample, unless we decided to do a random sample of households and mail something that drove them to the survey link. So yeah, we have really, back when we did more mail and phone surveys, we did do more random sampling. But as we've moved more toward online-based surveys, they tend to be more convenient sample just because we're getting the link and promoting it. The community is promoting it as much as possible in as many different places as possible.
Great. And the next question, any thoughts on pushing out questions in short spurts, like 3 to 5 questions on a mini survey, polling style, possibly choose to categorize them on specific topics, using social media, possibly share them out over a course of several weeks?
I think that sounds kind of fun. Like I haven't used that specifically, but again, people are more likely to take a quick short survey, right? If you tell me you've got 3 questions for me, I'm going to go in and just do them real quick. And if those can help, move towards something else, I think that's great because you're right. People do, and we are just seeing fewer and fewer responses to surveys in general. There's lower trust in institutions. So people are less likely to take surveys for things like this than they used to be. So I do think that's kind of a fun idea, the idea that people have shorter attention spans. How do we maximize the questions that we're asking to match with their attention span?
I put a question in chat, but I probably need to explain it. I don't see where it went. But anyway, Dr. Jolly,
Yeah.
Jolly. Um, when I have a 5 scale, that midpoint where I very much love it, I love it, or very much like it, or very much agree. In the middle, somewhat agree,
Mhm.
and then disagree and totally disagree or whatever. That somewhat, I always count it as the positive instead of the negative. But I'm rethinking all of that because it might be a little bit of positive and a little bit of negative. Can you advise me on that middle word?
So if I'm doing an agree or disagree, I'll have, let's say, my 5 end would be strongly agree, 4 would be agree, 3 would be neither agree nor disagree,
I
2
see.
would be disagree, and 1 would
And
be strongly disagree. That's what I would
yeah,
default to on the 5 point. If I were doing 6, I would make my 4 somewhat agree and my 3 somewhat disagree. So then it
disagree.
pushes off
Yeah,
like that.
that's middle ground. I appreciate that because I was at odds with people over here. I said, that's not 89%, that's 100%. And they were like, not so much, Pamela. Yeah, thank you.
You bet.
I'm on a Zoom. I'm on a Zoom.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can.
Hi, thank you so much for such an amazing presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I was wondering to follow up on the previous attendees' questions about midpoint.
Yes.
Do they throw off the results? Because I've heard if you answer in the middle, somewhat agree, somewhat disagree, it throws off the results. But I don't know, I don't have any scientific proof of it yet.
I don't know that I have scientific proof of it either. I think one of the things about a midpoint is that sometimes people will use it like that. They'll use it as the I don't know option or I don't really care option. And that's okay. Like neither agree nor disagree is kind of an I don't really care. So I don't necessarily know that it throws things off. I still do look at things across all of those. But I think it's a matter of preference and what your purpose is, and what you need to know on the back end. So I know we have 50 seconds. I don't know that that answered your question. I think, like I said, a lot of times it's a matter of preference and what your purpose is, and what you're trying to get at in your questions.
Appreciate it.
Oh. Thanks.
Okay. In our last few seconds, thank you, Dr. Jolly, for the presentation and your insights. And we are now rejoining the main conference session for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Abby.